Did you know the Punisher, Iggy Pop, and the Yellow Ranger were all psychopathic killers in a Crow movie? Yeah, that by itself is worth doing this show. The following is an in-depth story analysis and retrospective. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before listening to this review. There has been a Crow reboot in development hell for years now, and who knows if that will ever finally see the light of day, or I should say the light of buildings on fire, but I've never seen the point of that unless it's allowed to have a totally new, updated sensibility. And that's just rarely what happens with decade-later reboots. They tend to speak to the exact audience they spoke to originally, which is to say they don't speak to anybody, because they almost always play it safe, retelling the exact same story the exact same way, except with less artistry and heart. Just enough is different to say it's not the same thing, but enough is identical so fans of the original will recognize the major beats and iconography and feel at home. And so newcomers don't understand what all the fuss is about because you kind of had to be there in the first place. And diehards don't like it because it's the same movie, but worse, and they've already bought the DVD and the Blu-ray and the 4K releases over the years. So if they wanted to re-experience that movie, they could, watch it for the 500th time. And it wouldn't be watered down and miss the point. I'm looking at you, RoboCop 2014. That's not to say reboots are always cynical, of course. If you have a new, inspired take on an idea that's true to the spirit of the original, but would resonate with a modern audience in a way the first wouldn't, by all means. I still can't get my mind around the Child's Play remake. The Crow, at great financial and creative risk, is absolutely a good property to do that with. Not every person a Crow brings back to life to avenge his murder would be a goth rock star who lives in a loft, wears leather, and paints himself up in Kiss makeup. It might be interesting to see what a completely different person in a completely different era might do with his or her temporary resurrection, and that story could be used to comment on or wax cathartic about the injustices and social frustrations young people feel today, just as the original did with street crime and a sense of disenfranchisement with authority. But I'm disenfranchised with the establishment too, the establishment of Hollywood. Because I don't trust that movie would be made for any reason but to capitalize on nostalgia for the look, atmosphere, and sound of The Crow, any more than I could have trusted Dimension Films and Miramax not to do that just 2 years after the original, in 1996, with its sequel, which is what it did. Even if it was well written, it would have to be the same movie to sell, and we already have that movie, so what's the point? I would get a tattoo of a crow on my chest if that didn't turn out to be the same movie, but not as good, and I wouldn't even break a neon sign over it. There's really no reason to make that movie because we already have it. The Crow City of Angels is a lot like what I might expect from a modern remake, except I doubt the soundtrack would be as good. And it probably watched even more superfluous at the time, because it wasn't relying on decades-old love from fans to carry it. It was cashing in on a surprise cult phenomenon from just a couple years prior, and afraid to take the risk of getting too far away from the look and even the structure of Alex Proyas's masterpiece. And that's not to say it was phoned in, either. There's a lot of love and care put into this movie, which is arguably even more stylized and surreal than Brandon Lee's film. And some of that is because it had the same set designer. Music video director Tim Pope's visual style gels well with the instant classic dystopian aesthetic of the original, and the vibrant reds and oranges in the color palette help to distinguish it from its counterpart. There are wild, memorable performances here, like Iggy Pop as Curve, one of the new gang of murderous nutjobs who is always high, has these beady eyes that stay at the same white intensity every second he's on screen somehow, and who is every bit deranged and weird and unpredictable as Tintin or T-Bird in the first movie. He was apparently almost in that movie, and he would have fit right in. Unfortunately, the movie has two goals that can't be reconciled. Be similar enough the movie will sell, but different enough to avoid direct comparisons. I supposed it succeeded at the first. It had a respectable opening weekend and doubled its budget at the box office. but at the expense of truly being a new experience and standing on its own. It's essentially the same story again, but with a twist that isn't realized in the final version because Miramax insisted on re-editing it so it would be more like the original. I don't think even unadulterated, though, this would have been a great movie. It's smart to get away from Eric Draven for obvious reasons. Fans would have revolted after Brandon Lee's death, and the premise screams one-and-done stories about different characters back from the grave to deal with the people who wronged them in their own unique ways. But giving Ash, this new protagonist, Draven's iconic look is contrived, and it uses the first movie to create a Crow formula. It's the exact same situation, and it unfolds beat for beat. There's an innocent man in a dilapidated neighborhood, although maybe the whole city is a rundown neighborhood. It's LA this time instead of Detroit, but they're pretty much the same place. Overrun with drugs, controlled by gangs, and the only difference is this city has broken glass everywhere, and the name has an ironic winged savior motif. The City of Angels. The man, along with the person he cares most for in the world, this time a son and not a fiancé or wife, are murdered for no other reason than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A phrase which immediately comes to my head, by the way, and doesn't need to be spelled out in dialogue, but is, just like with the Kingpin at the end of the Daredevil movie. The man returns from the dead with no say in the matter to right this extreme injustice, right around Halloween. They both freak out upon realizing they're back from the dead and flash back to the moment of their death in audible agony. A psychotic gangster with delusions of grandeur is directly responsible, but the undead man only knows about the henchman who murdered him, so he takes each of them out one by one in theatrical and poetic fashion, usually uttering a pithy one-liner, or more often in this movie, throwing back whatever the nutjob said during the murder. And I'm pretty sure both kill one in an explosion, drops one out a window, and kills another after a street chase. They both only end up confronting the big bad because he decides to kill the Crow to remove the undead man's power, and they kidnap a girl the hero cares about. And believe it or not, it's the exact same girl in both movies. At the end, both our heroes return to the afterlife, having killed everyone responsible for destroying their lives, thus restoring some semblance of balance to the universe. And a crow flies off in the distance. And the crow represents love conquering evil. Especially in this one, where that's made as on the nose as possible because the crow is flying with Eric Draven's wedding ring in its mouth. Obviously, I've left out the differences so far, but they are few and far between and made worse by the hacksaw editing job, so the elements left of David Goyer's script that have most made this a different story hardly make any sense now. Goyer, who, as fate would have it, wrote the brilliant Dark City right after this, one of my favorite science fiction films, which was directed by none other than Alex Proyas, the director of the first film. Hey, let's play 3 Degrees of Crow Separation. Here's another one. This movie is set in LA. The TV series Angel is also set in LA, and for the same ironic reason. It's about demons and the occult, and its main character is a vampire named Angel in the City of Angels. Now, David Boreanaz played Angel and also appeared in the apparently terrible, though I have yet to see it, 4th Crow film, Wicked Prayer. Isn't that crazy? Anyway, it'll be easier to describe what was intended before I get into what's actually here, which I know from clues in the dialogue and from research into the original script and the initial cut director Tim Pope delivered to Miramax before they decided to make the story as purposefully derivative and uninteresting as possible. The director's cut has never been released, which is a shame because it sounds nearly Daredevil director's cut different. But the script is floating around online, and there's a fan work print cut, which Tim Pope apparently praised on social media. I haven't seen that cut, but I've watched Joe Blow's YouTube video on the subject, which does a good job of breaking down the differences. While the version Pope made would have still been too close to the first film, it included 2 major departures, which would have made it ultimately a decisively different story. First, Ash's relationship with Sarah, the little girl from the first film all grown up, was supposed to be a full-on romance. And B, Ash decides he doesn't want to return to the great beyond, mostly because he falls in love and continues on in the mortal plane, rather than returning to the dead like Eric Draven did. Those two ideas, the only new elements that make the piece stand apart, are almost totally gutted from the movie. And were they removed without a trace, this would be a mostly pointless but decent remake of the original. Like Home Alone 2, it's the same movie just set in a different place with some different incidental music. Except it wouldn't have the same sort of sequelitis Home Alone 2 does, because that's a remake with the same actor playing the same character, and it masquerades as a sequel. The only thing that connects this to the first film is Sarah, and she's only here to provide a reason for this undead wraith to wear Draven's face paint, so it'll look like a Crow movie and appeal to the same goth and punk rock crowd that loved the first film. I suspect that's why it was made so fast, too. 4 or 5 years after the original, and the kids screaming, "Down with the system, screw the man," become cogs in that system working for the man. In 1994, they're all Kurt Cobain or Lars Ulrich. In 1999, they're the cast from Office Space. And while Home Alone 2 is redundant and superfluous, it is a complete film that doesn't seem to be missing major pieces. I'd like this movie more if it was either a cohesive and competently made rehash of the first film, or the flawed but ambitious attempt to tell a different kind of story using the same trappings of the Proyas film. Because Pope's movie was rearranged and partly lobotomized, and carelessly, so remnants of the new ideas still remain, it is both of those things, and it doesn't work at all. And that's why Pope and Goyer both disavowed the movie. It's that Daredevil situation, except there's a nonsensical road to the same place the director's cut ultimately gets to. In the theatrical version of this movie, things are set up that never pay off, and characters do things that don't make sense. Like Curve freaking out on Sarah for giving him a crow tattoo when, he had to have known he was getting a tattoo of a crow while he was laying there in a chair and having it put permanently on his chest. Because the movie wasn't fully edited to match a different ending, an ending that is nearly identical to the first one. When Ash comes back to life, he is in that same Spawn-like agony Draven was in the first film, but he seems slower to embrace his purpose for returning. It looks like the movie might put him in the fore, get in his head more than we did with Draven, and explore what it's really like for this guy to be a loaded gun pointed at his killers, and how he feels about that. What if the guy brought back doesn't fully cooperate? At one point, he asks Sarah what happens when he's finished with his task, and she tells him he'll go back. Back to the afterlife, or just back to being dead, or whatever it's like for him after he's murdered. And he says, "What if I don't want to go back?" And I'm thinking, oh, this story totally played me. It's subverting my expectations, starting out just like the original, but then saying, this isn't Eric Draven, he's a different man and his circumstances are different. He lost a child, which is as bad or worse than losing a fiancé, of course, but Eric had no one else. He has Sarah, and they have this unique connection because of her connection to Eric and the Crow. There's totally something here. And then, that never comes up again. It's a completely meaningless throwaway line, and was the impetus for Ash's character arc in the intended version. Why on earth would you leave that scene in? The only thing I can figure is that that scene has no resolution at all without that exchange, so it would watch more random and pointless. But without it, you have almost no interaction with Ash and Sarah apart from their initial meeting and her painting the literal mask of comedy and tragedy on his face, before you get to his trying to rescue her at the end. But the only reason they even need screen time together is because this is supposed to be a romance, which is clear just from the tone of the performances. But since the romance is also axed, who cares? Sarah is a glorified plot device in the final version, which is a crying shame, because Mia Kirshner's performance is exceptional. She totally feels like that same character grown up now, and she imbues it with a lot of pathos and introversion. But not only is all the potentially interesting stuff lost because of distributor interference, yeah, the studio was totally on board, this time it was the distributor, but it's already problematic in the initial premise. Again, we've got that have your cake and eat it too situation. If it just stood on its own, let Ash wear whatever he'd think to wear and act however he'd think to act, you wouldn't need any tie to the original whatsoever. I do appreciate that there's a reason this guy is also wearing the face paint, if you gotta have that. Although it's odd because, to my eye, sometimes he has the white Joker paint and sometimes the sad black tear streaks and mouth outline seem to be painted just on top of his plain skin. But the excuse we get just to have the face paint becomes more contrived than just having him wear it for no reason. Sarah has dreams of the night Judah's henchmen kill him and his son. They saw these idiots kill someone, and Judah can't have any witnesses, despite the fact that the city seems to be a complete anarchistic state, and there's no Ernie Hudson character or any police to speak of, and Sarah sees all this through the Crow's eyes. So she knows this guy is coming back, like Eric Draven did, and she shows up to help guide him. Which she doesn't really need, because Eric had no guide, and again, this guy ends up doing absolutely everything Eric did. This is one of those movies with the correct instinct of flesh out and explore mythology established in a foundational movie that didn't get real deep into it. But like so many of these attempts, it just isn't thought through. Why does Sarah have this connection to the Crow? Just because she was there when another Crow brought back someone she cared about? Or is it because she has the wedding ring and she conveniently lives in the same city where it's happening? Is this the only other person who has been resurrected since Draven, or is there a proximity thing with this? Is this normal? Are there other living people who find out about loved ones brought back to avenge their own murders, and then they have dreams that tell them when that's about to happen to someone else? Do the celestial powers that be expect Sarah to help him? What would happen if she didn't? It really seems like she's only here to get Ash that face paint. And I guess Ash's son liking to paint and giving him a picture the day they died is supposed to make that whole thing more personal for him. Sarah uses the kid Danny's paint to do his face, which now that I think about it, those kind of look like watercolors, so I wouldn't think it would stay on. But that reads a little contrived when you put it on top of Sarah being the one that does the face painting. And now I'm just imagining her with a creepy booth at a carnival painting kids' faces to look like the Crow. And yeah, Ash is supposed to have that romance with her that doesn't happen in this version, but the love interest didn't have to be Sarah. Although, I do think her falling for another Wraith because he reminds her of the man who helped raise her in Eric Draven and had that same tragedy isn't a bad idea, especially with the drug angle, which isn't discussed. But her mother was a drug addict in the first movie, and that's why she was a deadbeat parent. And here, Sarah has moved to a city run by another drug gang that seems to have even more of a hold over the city than Top Dollar did in Detroit. And in the intended version, there are visual clues that she's a drug addict herself, though seems to not be using anymore. There's a lot of potential in all that, but I'd want to see her brought in some other way, and it's hard to do that organically. Apparently, Goyer even considered making Sarah the protagonist and the new victim brought back by the Crow herself, citing Miller's Elektra, which might have been fascinating, and I would have loved to see this actress play that part, certainly, but it's really hard to do that in a non-contrived way. It's easy to miss some of the layers in Kirshner's performance because I don't think she's given the right lead to play off of. Vincent Perez isn't a bad actor, but he seems a little lost in this role sometimes. His thick French accent, which is never commented on, is distracting, and sometimes I can't make out what he's saying. And the chemistry between them isn't quite there. But then some of that might be because the whole third act has changed. He was cast because Pope and his team were worried even a lead with an American accent would draw too many comparisons to Brandon Lee. But we're already going to do that because he's got that makeup. You're putting him in a lot of the same situations Draven was in, and there are lots of moments where he's supposed to elicit the same response from the audience. And he just doesn't have the presence or the manic energy to pull it off, like when he gets really crazy right before a kill. Every theatrical thing he does feels staged and rehearsed. Brandon Lee was the Phantom of the Opera, a character who is just naturally over the top and dramatic because of who he is and his circumstances. Vincent Perez is working his heart out. Don't get me wrong, but to me, he's Dolph Lundgren in, well, pretty much everything I've seen Dolph Lundgren play the lead in, like The Punisher and He-Man. He's just not the right guy. And some of that is the character himself. Draven was an MTV-esque rock musician. None of the stuff derived from that comes from any character placed with Ash. I don't even remember what this guy did for a living. It doesn't matter. He jumps from dead serious and understated to wild and psychotic because that's what the original did. For the same reason, we have another killer hard rock soundtrack scoring a lot of the movie. Everything about the production in the first movie was a reflection of the protagonist, but it still sounds like that because that's the Crow now. Another anti-establishment, unconventional piece that gets too popular and becomes the establishment itself. There's not much to say about this villain, except, once again, really interesting, distinct performance from Richard Brooks. There's something old-worldly about what he's doing here, like he belongs in a period piece around antiquity. I can't help but think he would have been a really good Stargate villain. Judah Earl is another power-hungry drug lord who rules with an iron fist. Instead of delusions of artistic genius like Top Dollar, this guy just gets off on other people's pain, as demonstrated in his opening scene where he shoots up the messenger with a drug he's told is part of a bad batch, making people go into convulsions, and he does that just to see what it'll do to this guy. This movie does seem concerned with topping the last in shock value and edginess, so Judah has a bondage fetish, constantly throwing sex parties with various men and women tied and tortured throughout his hideout. It is interesting to compare him with Top Dollar, on paper at least. That first villain was, curiously, obsessed with being original and an individual, and when his routine of setting the city on fire every year became routine, when he became the establishment, he decided to set one big fire, and then he planned to change his MO entirely. Of course, Draven kills him, and he doesn't get the chance. But Judah is the opposite. He is and wants to be the establishment, and his sex slaves and drug-controlled minions perhaps represent the bondage anyone finds themselves in that's under the thumb of a system that takes advantage of anyone it needs to flourish. Top Dollar was the other side of Draven's coin, both nonconformists who lived life on their own terms, except Draven did it while helping people, and Top Dollar hurt people as a means to that end. And Top Dollar, in a way, becomes the thing he hates. Whereas Judah isn't about chaos, he's about control, and it's his rules that get Ash and his son killed. But beyond that surface comparison with the previous bad guy, Judah is just the Top Dollar stand-in. Originally, he had a mystical backstory, something about peering into the literal abyss of death and that informing why he's the way he is, which might also have helped explain how he hooked up with his right-hand witch lady, who's a blind clairvoyant because she gouged her own eyes out, hoping that would make her vision stop, just so she can tell the bad guy about the Crow in the third act. Which is a lot like the right-hand hench lady in the first movie, though I'm fuzzy on whether or not she was supposed to be a clairvoyant as well. And I have no idea why this woman turns on Judah at the end and helps Sarah escape, minutes after she gives Judah the idea to kidnap Sarah and kill the Crow in the first place. The ending is so weird and confusing, and on first viewing I had no investment in the story at that point because it was so obviously the same movie after teasing me with something new and not delivering. Once Sarah gets kidnapped again, I'm like, okay, I'm out. But basically, Ash loses his powers just like Eric does in the first movie, except this time the villain suddenly seems unkillable and has powers of his own. I'm unclear as to why. Did he already have occult powers because of the dark arts dabbling he and Sybil, the clairvoyant, seem to be doing, or when he says, "I have taken your power," is that meant to be literal? Does he have his own powers, or does he have Ash's? It doesn't really matter, though, because after Ash impales him and he laughs it off, Ash pulls a Dark Knight and sends hundreds of crows after Judah at once. And then he screams in agony and just disappears. I was shocked Sam Hamm had nothing to do with the script, considering how many times he had tried to get the Frank Miller Army of Bats thing in Batman movies. I don't know what's going on here. And Sarah makes the selfless sacrifice move, letting herself get killed to spare a dead man who she knows is going back to the afterlife when this is all over. If she loves him, and he's been working toward getting to stay on Earth and live a life, that makes sense, and might be tragic and surprising, and I might feel something about it. In this version, it's there because Pope shot it, and they didn't have anything to replace it with. And no other reason. I suppose you could argue that she saves him so he can defeat Judah, who LA really needs to die a horrible death at his earliest convenience, but I doubt in the moment she's calculating enough to think, okay, Ash is more or less mortal and helpless right now, but if I put myself in harm's way, maybe he'll make it and have some impossible trick up his sleeve. All I needed was for this to actually be a love story, and I wouldn't question that at all. Here are some other miscellaneous points before I close out. More surreal than seeing Iggy Pop, Twee Trang, and Thomas Jane's names all on screen at once in a credit sequence was seeing the original Yellow Ranger as Callie sing a lullaby to a child she's murdering and get thrown out of a window onto a car. Get it? She's named Callie because they're in Los Angeles, California. She gives a really twisted and creepy performance, and I was shocked it's her character who kills the kid and whose death is most personal for Ash. This is the last thing she did before her tragic death in a car accident in 2001, and after finally seeing this movie, I'm really surprised she didn't do anything after it. Of course, it's sad she died at such a young age, at 27, and it's crazy to think she was only 22 when she did this. The soundtrack for this movie is really solid. It's moody, a nice variety of hard-edged rock and emo stuff, and it's loud and noisy, but it's mostly pretty melodic and listenable. I've had Gold Dust Woman by Done Again stuck in my head all week, but the way the music is utilized is a lot more in-your-face and intrusive than in the last movie, and not just because there's no character reason for it to be here. A lot of the incidental music in the first Crow is integrated in a way where it's easy not to think about it, unless you're actively listening for it. It's one element of the overall ambiance. In the same way Power Rangers is a toy commercial, this feels like an ad for an album, and some tracks feel too on the nose because they're used so blatantly, like White Zombie's cover of I'm Your Boogeyman by Casey and the Sunshine Band. But it has a surprisingly cohesive sound for a compilation album, and some standout tracks that'll stick with me, like Shelf Life by Mary 3. I won't go back to City of Angels, but I do see myself playing this album again. It nearly justifies the movie's existence. There's a sense of heart and humanity to the original Crow, juxtaposed with the darkness and the chaos and the intentionally one-dimensional evil sickos that resonates with an audience. It's a super heightened, super stylized world, but what's familiar is the gamut of emotions Eric Draven displays throughout the movie. He's not just sad and depressed. He's enraged, he's confused, he's lonely, and he finds moments of true joy, like when he shares a laugh with a new friend in Ernie Hudson's Sergeant Albrecht, not just in disposing of his killers. That's largely missing in this movie. That's partly because the romance and the stuff about Ash wanting to stay on Earth is cut. I'm walled off from my protagonist, and I don't see him do much but brood, kill, and revel in revenge. But it's also because we don't have that Eyes-In character we had in Albrecht. Sarah is supposed to be that character, I think, but she's too wrapped up with the history and mythology of this world, and she's not that down-to-earth tethered to sanity and hope that Ernie Hudson's character was. I'm sure this is a way better movie if Miramax had left it well enough alone, but knowing as much as we do about it, I think I still would have questioned the validity of the premise, and even of making a sequel to such a standalone movie that was so of its time at all, at least right then. Like The Mask, I think The Crow is something you can make time and time again, but you have to let the flavor and the attitude change with the unique identity of each protagonist. The Crow is more challenging because with The Mask, at least you have an iconic look in the artifact that transforms each character. They're all going to have that green face, but The Crow could potentially look like anything. Who's to say everyone who's brought back by a crow would even feel the need to wear a theatrical costume? And The Crow was so much about the culture that birthed it. I think the most dignified thing to do with it, the thing that would be most true to the original spirit, is to wait at least a decade between each movie. Let the culture evolve. Let a new generation of kids go to high school and start college, and make drastically different movies that are about today's disenfranchised youth. Because we still have those, and they're still disenfranchised about some of the same things, but they live in a different world with new problems to contend with new mutated versions of the old ones. Oh, I just realized I never did the single most obvious thing with a movie that has horror sensibilities, occult and undead stuff, and a protagonist named Ash. Ah, crap. Too late now. So, just imagine an obligatory Evil Dead reference, okay? Before we get to my verdict, let's find out what some of the patrons said with some tweet-length reviews. This time we just have a couple. Michael Austin Gulick says, unfairly maligned sequel to a near-perfect original. Its visuals alone are fantastic, and the score and soundtrack are some hidden gems. But the muddled ending from studio interference hurts it, and despite being worth a watch, it's just inherently not as strong as the first movie. 2.5 out of 4. And Bag Studios, this is a pretty darn good YouTube fan film, I guess. Some neat kills, terrible boss fights, bad acting, and it's slow. I'd be a lot more impressed if this was a First Crow film, but most of its strengths are directly ripped from Lee's. I'll say it would make an okay one-shot graphic novel. To me, The Crow City of Angels is a Diet Coke. It's packaged a lot like the original, it tastes kind of similar, it wants to be the same but also different, it's missing the key ingredient that made the original so special, and there's nothing it can do about that. I'm giving this movie a 2 out of 4. Thanks a lot, everybody, as always, for listening. Really hope you enjoyed the review. If you haven't gotten the memo yet and you're listening to this currently on YouTube, I just wanted to let you know that it is available now, Superhero Rewind, as a podcast on Anchor and also Spotify. And the entire library of Superhero Rewind reviews is also there. If you found this as a podcast, I want to let you know that we have a YouTube channel called Geekvolution with content going back over a decade. I also want to say thanks to all of our patrons, of course, and I'd like to especially thank our Patreon producers, and I will read their names right now, including IronBat1993, Zach, Wendell Jones, Victor, Nick Manna, Nicholas Morgan, Michael Gulick, Michael Micheletti, Kareem Roberts, Jacob Schneider, Damon Begay, CM Productions, Thomas Edgehill, The Day Ghost, Stone Gassman, Snuffles, Wrights, Red Bandit, Lone Wolf Jedi of Gotham, Kevin, Carl Maxey, Bag Studios, Josh Hughes, John McClain, Ian McKee, Elliot Slater, Dylan Musciello, Chewbacca's Lover, Caleb, Azim, and Red Bandit. You can write a tweet-length review to be included at the end of reviews at the $5 tier on Patreon, and lots of really cool perks just at the bottom tier, the $2 tier, including Captain Logan After Dark. So check that out if you're so inclined. Next time, I'm going to do a special list video, and I don't want to reveal what that is yet, so you'll just have to see next time. That should be coming soon. In the meantime, once again, you guys are wonderful, and I'll see you again for another Rewind in the not-too-distant future. Later, folks.